And now, the Trumpet Daily with Stephen Flurry.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily radio show. Another beautiful afternoon here at Edstone. Can't believe it's the last day of the work week. Good to join you, though, and good of you to join us. We've got a few emails to get through, one here at the start, and then another. I keep getting emails from some of our listeners that have been around for quite some time, that have talked about just how it used to be in schools with prayer and with God and the Bible and all these things that today have just been erased. Is it any wonder that our society is the way it is? We'll get to that in just a second. This one here says, I hope you all are well. Listening to your broadcast reminded me of the scripture, your cities are burned with fire. It says, before the Rodney King riots, people were already milling around, and it was an excuse that they needed. Will we see this happen again sooner than later? What will be the level of reaction this time? Either way, it says, it fulfills prophecy, and Jesus Christ will return sooner. It says we need that, and we need God's broadcast to stir us to action, a godly action, not ungodly rioting, and that's certainly what we're seeing a lot of right now, a lot of ungodly action, and a lot of people inciting it, a lot of people even applauding it, encouraging people to get out, encouraging the authorities to leave, to create space for the rioters. And it ought to make us, as that listener points out, just pray all the more fervently that God's kingdom would come, that God's kingdom would be set up and established on this earth so that you don't have to see these kinds of images anymore. People taking hammers into Target and bashing the cash registers, trying to get the cash. All the goods are gone, so here they go, looking for money. They're doing this for what? Justice? They want justice for George Floyd? They see this as an opportunity to carry out their violent actions in normal times. These are far from normal. But in normal times, a case of police brutality would be dealt with in the court of law, and if an officer is found guilty, then he'd go off to prison. But these are not normal times, are they? And this is why Minneapolis is burning. The AP reported that there were 30 fires, at least 30 fires in Minneapolis last night. This is the third night of rioting. And the residents there, they're seeing their city go up in flames, and there's virtually no pushback from the authorities. And then if President Trump says something strong, if he pushes back, well, then he's the problem. He's the problem when he comes along and says Minneapolis needs to get this thing under control. You can't just let people run through the community, setting fires all over the place, bashing in windows. The AP said this, among the casualties of the overnight fires, a 6-story building under construction that was to provide nearly 200 apartments of affordable housing. So housing for low-income people, that went up in flames, 200 apartments. And here they are, cheering one another on as they take over a police station. The police were told to evacuate. Think of this. The police evacuating their station to give a little extra space to the rioters. Well, it's like this listener brings out, Isaiah 1 and verse 7, we're seeing it. We're seeing these prophecies being fulfilled. My father gave a program, 5 years ago on Isaiah 1 and verse 7, this very verse. And here's what he had to say, clip 14.
But did you know that these burning cities were actually prophesied in your Bible? That it is prophecy in your Bible. Isaiah 1 and verse 7 states that your cities are burned with fire. Does that prophecy have anything to do with us today? Well, you can prove that it does. God tells us in Isaiah chapter 1 why we have these violent protests and the burning of the cities. And He also tells us how to solve that problem. And I think we ought to be very much interested in that. How do you solve that problem?
How do we solve these problems? There is a solution. It's in the Bible. Isaiah 30. This week we've been talking about deleting God from the history books, deleting God from the educational system, deleting God from society. This MacArthur book I was reading last night, he was old school. He talked about patriotism and said how it went together hand in hand with God and the Bible, with Christianity. In other words, you need God as part of your society. And of course, again, these were times when, whether it's Churchill, MacArthur, or whoever, there wasn't an understanding of God's purpose, but at least there was something like a biblical morality that was upheld. I didn't have time to go and find some historical examples, but there have to be hundreds and hundreds of them, going back even just a couple generations ago, where the authorities would come out and uphold law and order and protect personal property. Today, they run away. What's the cause? What's the solution? Isaiah 30 and verse 11, it says, "Get you out of the way, turn aside out of the path, cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us." Just get God out of here. And well, we're seeing what happens. We delete God from the picture. We delete God from the history. We delete God from society. And it's just anarchy. Is that what we want? That's what a lot of people want. There's a lot of people, a lot of powerful people that are justifying this kind of violence, this kind of mayhem. President Trump, yesterday, in talking about this case with George Floyd, he said this, clip one.
No, I haven't, but I feel very, very badly. It's a very shocking sight. Bill and I were talking about it before. It's one of the reasons Bill's here right now, because, as you know, we're very much involved. And I've asked the Attorney General, FBI, and the Attorney General to take a very strong look and to see what went on, because that was a very, very bad thing that I saw. I saw it last night, and I didn't like it.
So he sees the video. He didn't like it. He talked about Bill being there with him. That's the Attorney General, Bill Barr. He's getting the federal authorities involved, quickly even. He's getting the authorities involved. Isn't this what the radical left wants? Don't they want some kind of swift government action? Well, he's still the problem. The president is, because he tweets out that, look, at the same time, you've got to get control of the streets. He said in a tweet, "I can't stand back and watch this happen to a great American city, Minneapolis." He says a total lack of leadership. Either the very weak radical left mayor, Jacob Fry, get his act together and bring the city under control, or I'll send in the National Guard and get the job done right. He says these thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd. They're dishonoring the memory. And then further on in that tweet, he talks about if you want to go on and loot these businesses, if the looting begins, then the shooting begins. In other words, we'll shoot you if you're violating these laws, if you're destroying property. And Twitter had to flag that one because, well, it glorified violence, said Twitter. Can you believe this? And then you wonder why the president's coming out with these executive orders. Because they're not that far away from banning him. From deleting him, the president of the United States. He has this executive order yesterday where basically it's an ultimatum to these social media sites saying that if you're going to start censoring me, then you have to censor everyone equally, or else you're no longer a platform. You're actually a publisher. And then you can be held liable. So that was from the president yesterday. Then he's in the press conference, and of course the reporters are there saying, well, if you're so critical of Twitter, then why don't you just delete your account? Why don't you just walk away? And this was how the president responded to that. Clip 10.
Mr. President, given your concern with Twitter, have you given any consideration to deleting your account, to just walking away from this platform you've been so critical of?
Well, if you weren't fake, I would not even think about it. I would do that in a heartbeat.
I'm real,
but
sir.
the news is fake. If you look at what gets printed in newspapers, if only the public could understand where, they're reading a story and they think it's real, and it's not real in so many cases. And I'm not saying in every case. You have some great journalists. You have some journalists that I have great respect for. But largely, I find, at least in a political sense, there's so much fake news, it's disgraceful. I would do that in a heartbeat if we had a fair press in this country, I would do that in a heartbeat. There's nothing I'd rather do than get rid of my whole Twitter account, but I'm able to get to, I guess, 186 million people when you add up all the different accounts and add Facebook and Instagram. It's a lot of people, and that's more than the media companies have, frankly, by a lot. And so if I get a story that's wrong, I can put a social media. I don't usually use the word Twitter. I say social media. But I put something out, and the next day or the next hour or the next minute, everybody's reading about it. So I'm able to refute fake news, and that's very important.
That's very important for him and his message. This is how he goes direct to the people. This is how he knows his message won't be filtered or distorted by a hostile media, by a media that hate him, that despise him. If he's not there for a press conference, they criticize him for not being transparent. Then he comes out and talks all the time, and they say, you ought to go away. We can't run these live anymore. They hate it. They hate the fact that he can speak out as he did this week, saying, look, if this Minneapolis mayor doesn't get control of his streets, I will. That was brought up, by the way, to the mayor, Jacob Fry. And here's how he responded to President Trump's tweet, clip 5.
Weakness is refusing to take responsibility for your own actions. Weakness is pointing your finger at somebody else during a time of crisis. Donald Trump knows nothing about the strength of Minneapolis. We are strong. Is this a difficult time period? Yes, but you better be sure that we're going to get through this.
Okay, if you watched the entire press conference from that mayor, he's very calm, even as his city is burning, even as he's evacuating police precincts, he's very calm and collected. And the only time he gets riled up is in response to a tweet from the president saying, get it under control. Get your city under control. Now, nothing enrages the left like a tweet from the President of the United States. This is the greatest offense in their eyes. This is why, like they say at MSNBC, he needs to be deleted. He needs to be banned from Twitter. He's the problem. And meanwhile, the backdrop, the entire backdrop of this press conference from this mayor, this radical left-wing mayor, is his city going up in flames. Minneapolis is burning. Listen to the mayor here as he talks about his decision, together with the police chief, to evacuate the 3rd precinct. Clip 2.
Earlier this evening, after receiving real-time information from our Chief Arredondo, and after having numerous phone calls with him regarding the evolving situation at the 3rd precinct, it became clear that there were imminent threats to both officers and public. And the danger became necessary, and I made the decision to evacuate the 3rd precinct.
So lives were coming under threat from the rioters. Policemen were in danger, as were the protesters. That's the way he sees it. They're just protesters. So what did he do? He evacuated the 3rd precinct so that these rioters could destroy it. He had the police leave the scene of a crime. The representative, Ilhan Omar, she tweeted out last night, shooting rubber bullets and tear gas at unarmed protesters when there are children present should never be tolerated, ever. What is happening tonight in our city is shameful. Police need to exercise restraint. See, the problem is the police. They're all like that one who had his knee to the neck of the individual who died. Tragically. Everyone's guilty now. All the police, all of white people, as you'll hear here in just a second. She says, police need to exercise restraint, and our community needs space to heal. They need space. You remember this from 5 years ago? The mayor of Baltimore saying, hey, we're going to clear it away so that they can destroy it if they need to. That's clip 12.
We also gave those who wished to destroy space to do that as well.
That's from 5 years ago. The mayor of Baltimore giving space so that the rioters could destroy. And so here's the same thinking now. And just 2 weeks ago, by the way, these same people, so many of them were outraged that people would protest around the capital of Michigan because they want their businesses to be reopened. That was dangerous. That was a very dangerous protest. This, no problem here. It's mostly, it's just mostly protesters. The police need to leave. They need to stop firing rubber bullets. No tear gas, nothing. Just let them burn it down. And they're burning it. 30 businesses going up in flames. Windows being smashed in. Target overrun with looters. The 3rd precinct, the police force, evacuated. It's too dangerous. And so the police just leave. And here's how the Minneapolis mayor justified that. Clip 3.
The symbolism of a building cannot outweigh the importance of life, of our officers or the public. We could not risk serious injury to anyone. And we will continue to patrol the 3rd precinct entirely. We will continue to do our jobs in that area. And, brick and mortar is not as important as life.
These people have lost their minds. They cannot think straight. Let's just let our city go up in flames. As long as we don't lose one life, and you heard some of this with the coronavirus. Look, we'll destroy the economy. We'll destroy all these businesses. We'll destroy people's livelihoods so long as we don't lose one life. And so they let the rioting continue. Cities going up in flames. And really, you see leadership, true leadership going up in flames as well. Again, I don't have the examples here in front of me, but how would Teddy Roosevelt have dealt with rioting, or Abraham Lincoln, or John Adams? Even more recently, you go back to the turbulent 60s era, and at least there was a show of force where necessary. Now, of course, America is very proud of its peaceful protesting tradition. And I suppose there's a fine line at times between what's peaceful and what isn't. But this is clearly rioting, and they're coming in from out of town even to join in on the fun. This is like the resurgence of Antifa. They went quiet for a couple years, and now they're back. And they're being encouraged. Here's an opportunity. Never let a crisis go to waste. Here's a bit more from the mayor's press conference yesterday, clip 4.
I will just say that it was clear to me, and also hearing from our local community leaders, that many of the people that were involved in the criminal conduct last night were not known Minneapolitans to them. And so yes, there were certainly people who were involved in the activities last night that were certainly not recognized as being here from the city.
That's a separate press conference with the police chief, acknowledging that people were coming from out of town to help do the burning, to join in on the looting. And it's probably not going to be that long before these left-wing organizations bust them in. Why not? Bring down the system. You've got to bring it down because, well, through and through, this is not, as the mayor of Minneapolis has explained, this is not an isolated incident. This police officer and George Floyd, this is in America's DNA. This goes back centuries. Here's the Minneapolis mayor explaining how deep-seated this problem is. Clip 6.
What we've seen over the last 2 days and the emotion-ridden conflict over last night is the result of so much built-up anger and sadness. Anger and sadness that has been ingrained in our black community, not just because of 5 minutes of horror, but 400 years. If you're feeling that sadness and that anger, it's not only understandable, it's right. It's a reflection of the truth that our black community has lived. While not from lived experience, that sadness must also be understood by our non-black communities.
And so that's the tone that the left-wing media take, that we've got to try to understand the anger. We've got to try to understand what's fueling the rage. He says it goes back 400 years. That's the 1619 Project. This bogus project sponsored by the New York Times. It's proven to be based in fantasy. All of these errors pointed out by historians on the right and the left. And yet still, it goes forward, and it's working its way into schools. It's found its way right into the mayor's office in Minneapolis. 400 years. This is not a 5-minute incident that was caught on video. This is everywhere. And it's been everywhere for 400 years. Here's another leader from Minneapolis, City Council member Andrea Jenkins. She said this, clip 11.
I am asking my colleagues, the mayor, and anyone else who is concerned about the state of affairs in our community to declare a state of emergency, declaring racism as a public health issue. Until we name this virus, this disease that has infected America for the past 400 years, we will never, ever resolve this issue.
So there's your leadership in Minneapolis. 400 years. You got the coronavirus, and now you've got the racism virus. And then there's the media, of course, just doing everything possible to pour fuel on fire. Listen to Ali Velshi, I think is how you say his name. He's from MSNBC. He's on the scene in Minneapolis. This is clip 7.
We have to remember this. The National Guard has been activated. They are not here. The police are not here. The police have been evacuated. The fire engines can't get in here. There is no ability to bring anybody in here to solve this problem. So I want to be clear in how I characterize this. This is mostly a protest. It is not generally speaking unruly.
Did you hear what he said there? And did you see what he's standing in front of? There's a building going up in flames. The police have been evacuated. And he says, generally speaking, this is not unruly. This is just a protest. He's on the scene of the rioting. And the police have been evacuated. The fire trucks can't even get in there. And there's your reporting. What was it Victor Davis Hanson said? I read it to you yesterday. Whether it's MSNBC or CNN, CBS, the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, PBS, if they say one thing, you can pretty much conclude that the opposite is true. The opposite is true. He calls it the doctrine of media untruth. Black is white, up is down. We can't think straight. We're seeing this failure in leadership on display every day. And the corruptness of the commentators, the reporters. There's no truth in the land. It's just all the agenda, all the lies. And of course, there's a spirit behind it, as we well know. John 8 and verse 44. Listen to CNN's Don Lemon from last night, clip 8.
We need to realize, and that meaning we as a culture, we as Americans, and that means I'm speaking to white people. It is incumbent upon white people to deal with racism in this culture. You cannot have the people who are abused get rid of the problem, because it is not their problem. It is the problem of the person who is abusing them, who can't even see it. They are blinded by it.
And then later on, as he discusses this same topic with his colleague, Chris Cuomo, they had this exchange, clip 15.
It is not incumbent upon black people to stop racism, to stop this. It is incumbent upon people who hold the power in this society to help to do that, to do the heavy lifting. And guess who that is? Who is that, Chris?
White people.
So there you go. And what must the rest of the world think as they view this? As they watch this in Russia and China, in the Middle East, here in Europe? There's your commentators saying that the problem in America is the white people. They want to see it go up in flames. Let's be honest. They're happy about these images because it brings the rage to the center of attention. And white people need to understand this. The problem, well, it's brought out all through the Bible, but this passage in Isaiah 1, I read verse 7 earlier, but further on in the chapter it says, if you be willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land, but, Isaiah 1 and verse 20, but if you refuse and rebel, you shall be devoured with the sword, for the mouth of the Eternal has spoken it. Here's the problem. Here's root causes. If you delete me out of the equation, cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us. If you rebel, you're going to be devoured with the sword. And so we're seeing Isaiah 1 being fulfilled. We're about to see Ezekiel 4 and 5 be fulfilled, just as the Bible has prophesied. My father wrote back in 2015, this is in the article, "Your cities are burned with fire." And it says, what will all this violence do to the nation? What will America's enemies do when they see this terrible division among the American population? What are our enemies going to do when they see this spectacle? And then, as I say, the commentators who 2 seconds ago, they were saying, don't go outside, you fools. You're fools for going outside. And now they're saying these are courageous people, I suppose, going outside to protest, even as 30 buildings go up in flames. Police are evacuated. They've got to have space, you see. Space to destroy. As my father wrote, race is a highly charged subject in the U.S. today and in many other nations. Past wrongs and present inequalities create fertile ground for hurt, frustration, and anger. It says many prominent leaders, both black and white, are deliberately fueling those grievances for their own political gain. They are using race as a deadly weapon. The problems that will result are far more dangerous than they realize. It's like we've been saying with this COVID-19. The cure, the things we put in place to try to fix it, it's worse than the disease. Here you have one incident, an isolated incident that the president himself said, look, I'm sending in the federal authorities. I do want to get to the bottom of this. And that triggers race riots all over the United States, especially in Minneapolis, but it's spreading. I think I saw on Fox last night, there's signs going up on some of these businesses from black owners saying, look, this business is operated by a black owner. In other words, don't burn this one down, burn the others. It's all about race. As my father says, when you look objectively at the facts of these high-profile racially charged riots, you can see why they are certain to grow much worse. Many powerful politicians and people in the media believe that there is justification for the violence tearing up our cities. Many say they understand why lawlessness is overtaking these areas. This is my father's writing from 5 years ago. I've been quoting a fair bit from him just this week. It's like, and from a few years ago, and it applies to what we're seeing right now. Hopefully you're a subscriber to the Trumpet. Tomorrow's headlines, today. He says some even think there is something noble about it. They see it as a kind of righteous search for long-denied justice. And then he says, finally, this is terribly misguided and perverse reasoning. It is multiplying the problems many times over. Thus, from your cities are burned with fire, from the July 2015 Philadelphia Trumpet. There's a sickness in Israel. That too is in Isaiah 1, just before the cities will burn with fire. That's verse 7. But you read about the sickness from head to toe in verses 5 and 6. And that there's no soundness at all in our thinking. As he said, this is a terribly misguided and perverse way to reason. You're listening to Stephen Flurry, and this is the Trumpet Daily Radio Show. If you'd like to email the program, you can send comments to td@kpcg.fm. We'll be right back.
This is KPCG-FM, and this is the Trumpet Daily. Are we living in the last days? Some dismiss the notion as fanatical, But world leaders and news analysts are issuing warnings that are becoming more and more dire. Could Bible prophecies about the last days actually be accurate? Our brochure can help guide you through the relevant news and history and help you compare these events to what the Bible says. Are we living in the last days? This brochure is available for free right now at thetrumpet.com. From the Philadelphia Church of God campus in Edstone, England, this is the Trumpet Daily program with Stephen Flurry.
Quite a few listeners commenting on just how different it was being educated back 40, 50, 60 years ago. This one here, an 85-year-old, says, "Thank you so much. Your program is a great way to start my day. I, too, remember each new day with the scriptures and prayer in school. What a difference it has made in my life. I'm now 85 years old, and I believe more strongly than ever in God's Word." That's an 85-year-old listener chiming in. Here's another one. It says, "Thank you ever so much for Wednesday's program, Deleting God from Our Own History. It brought back happy memories of my boyhood school days, which were so different from what is out there today. During the elementary school years, we began each day by reciting the Lord's Prayer, followed by the pledging allegiance to the flag," it says. "In those days, it was not the Canadian maple leaf flag, but rather the red ensign, a flag of the national coat of arms on a red background with the British flag in the upper corner. After that, we would sing 'God Save the Queen.'" This is a school in Canada. Not that long ago. He says social studies over the years covered the exciting history of Canadian exploration and many units about the history of Great Britain and the British Empire, called in those days the Commonwealth of Nations. I think it was some of that which started my own interest in history. And then in senior high school, there was Miss Claire McKinley, who really ignited what eventually became a passion to accompany my life career as a school teacher. It says, "In university, I took Canadian history as a minor during a time when it was still an exciting subject to read and study. Now most children learn about indigenous history, globalization, and multiculturalism. God has most certainly been removed from the curriculum." God has been removed. And so what are we left with? We're left with a lot of historical revisionism. We're left with things like the 1619 Project. We're left with a lot of content that's just, frankly, boring, as I said yesterday. This listener says, "I look very forward to the kingdom of God when true history will be restored worldwide." True history. History with God in it. History where God is discussed. As I've been saying this week, you don't have to go back very far to hear from leaders, to hear from commentators who talked about God being very much in it, very much part of it, part of the historical record. Winston Churchill, I'll play it for you one more time. This is from his speech on December 26th, 1941, before the U.S. Congress, clip 13.
If you will allow me to use other language, I will say that he must indeed have a blind soul who cannot see that some great purpose and design is being worked out here below, of which we have the honor to be the faithful servants. It is not given to us to peer into the mysteries of the future. Still I avow my hope and faith, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come the British and American peoples will, for their own safety and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice, and in peace.
Standing ovation for Winston Churchill, talking about some great purpose being worked out here below. God working out some great purpose. If you can't see that, you must be a blind soul. Well, there's lots of blind souls on earth today. Blindness has set in. Churchill, as I said earlier this week, he was influenced by his nanny. She gave him, in many ways, she gave him a love for the King James Bible. And he studied. He read from that book. He wasn't religious per se. But he, as you just heard there, he believed that God was working out some purpose, that God, even in his own individual life, that God had interfered. My father made a point of that 3 years ago at his youth camp sermon, where he talked about if God interfered in this young man's life, someone that did not understand the purpose and plan of God, what can he do with you? You young people in God's church, in God's family. You have this God family vision. You understand that great purpose that's being worked out here below. Some great purpose. What a blessing it is to be able to see spiritually. Where there's no vision, the people perish, the proverb says. Thank God for the vision that he gives to us. Tell him how much you appreciate his involvement, his interference at times. Violet Bonham Carter, she wrote about Churchill. I passed through a violent and aggressive anti-religious phase. This is actually Churchill. She's quoting from Churchill, saying he passed through this aggressive anti-religious phase. He's speaking of his younger years, which, had it lasted, might easily have made me a nuisance. My poise was restored during the next few years by frequent contact with danger. I found that whatever I might think and argue, I did not hesitate to ask for special protection when about to come under the fire of the enemy, nor to feel sincerely grateful when I got home safe and sound. In other words, when I had this stage, this phase I went through, where I was anti-religious, but then as I started to confront danger, well, he thought about God a lot more. He prayed for protection. He asked for special protection and gave God thanks. And God did intervene multiple times to protect him. There was the battle at Omdurman, where Churchill, he fell off his horse right in the heat of a battle, an intense battle, and he found himself about a mile from cover, an easy, open target. And that's when this mysterious British scout showed up riding a pale horse. Churchill wrote about this incident later. This individual got him on his horse and carried him away to safety. Saved by this mysterious scout on a pale horse. Churchill said, "Death in Revelation, but life to me." The pale horse in Revelation, symbolizing death. But he says, "Life to me," somewhat humorously, obviously. Was he saved miraculously? Well, some would like to say this is all just happenstance or luck. What about down in South Africa after a train wreck and then being taken captive? He was a prisoner. And then there was this escape from captivity. William Manchester wrote this. He did it over and over. He had reached the prison latrine just as the sentry was lighting his pipe, had found the one train which passed through Pretoria that night, and blindly knocked on the door of the one man in the mining district who could and would help him through to the Portuguese border, and had been spared 1,000 times in battle since then, while the first bullet had found poor Jack. That's speaking of his brother. His brother got shot. He didn't die, but his brother got shot first thing. Whereas Churchill, just over and again, miraculously saved, protected. That individual, the door that he knocked on, he was in hostile territory. Anybody else would have returned him to captivity. This was the one individual that helped to save him, that helped him get through to the Portuguese border. Churchill later wrote this. He said, "I realized with awful force that no exercise of my own feeble wit and strength could save me from my enemies, and that without the assistance of that high power which interferes in the eternal sequence of causes and effects more often than we are always prone to admit, I could never succeed. I prayed long and earnestly for help and guidance. My prayer, as it seems to me, was swiftly and wonderfully answered." That was Churchill writing about one of his sleepless nights as a fugitive in South Africa. He prayed long and earnestly for help and for guidance. That's Winston Churchill. That's a prime minister of Britain. There was the time in 1911 when he became First Lord of the Admiralty that he was considering his responsibilities. He was in a hotel room, I believe, and there was a Bible, and he just plopped it open, and it fell to Deuteronomy 9. And I'll just leave it to you to read the first 5 verses. But he credited that instance with just shaping some of his thinking about policy for the Navy. This is from a letter he wrote to Clementine in 1915, I believe. It says, "It is all chance or destiny, and our wayward footsteps are best planted without too much calculation. One must yield oneself simply and naturally to the mood of the game and trust in God," which is another way of saying the same thing. Well, I think this was after the Dardanelles disaster, and so then he went off to the front lines, and his wife was understandably concerned about his safety. And he told her, "Look, don't worry about it. Just put your trust in God. That's all that we can do. If it's my time to go, then it's my time to go." It's just the thinking, even the thinking back then compared to today. What kind of weakness coming from a city mayor and a police chief when they're coming to burn down the headquarters? What kind of thinking just empties it out? You've got police right there to deal with it. How would this have been dealt with 40, 50, 60 years ago? It says something about where we are. We're seeing Isaiah. The pages of Isaiah are coming to life. They're happening. It was just a different time. He was in his dugout, by the way, and called away for a meeting that ended up getting canceled. And Churchill was a little upset by that as he was then taken back to his dugout. And then when he got there, he found out that the dugout had been bombed just a few minutes after he left in the morning. And some of the people that were in there with him died. God's hand. God's hand. He wrote about that incident in 1927. He said he felt the strong sensation that a hand had been stretched out to move me in the nick of time from that fatal spot. That was from 1927. In 1915, he wrote to his wife, "My conviction that the greatest of my work is still to be done is strong within me, and I ride reposefully along the gale." That's kind of like what he told to his bodyguard. "Look, I still have a great work to do. I'm not going to die. Don't worry about it." He was sure. He wrote this to his wife in 1915. "Above all, don't be worried about me. If my destiny has not been accomplished, I shall be guarded surely. God's going to look after me. If I haven't yet fulfilled my destiny, then I'll be protected. Don't you worry about me." As for meaning and purpose, this is what he wrote to Violet Asquith in 1915 as well, that that when one watches the extraordinarily arbitrary and haphazard way in which death and destruction are meted out by providence, this is commenting on the carnage in Europe during World War I. He says, no guiding principle of justice or expediency apparently at work, one feels more than ever convinced of the unimportance of life. What is the purpose here? Look at what we're doing to ourselves, he was saying. And then he wrote, it cannot matter as much as one thinks whether one is alive or dead. The absolute planlessness here makes one suspect a bigger plan elsewhere. So when you think about God's purpose and plan, these 6,000 years where God has allowed man, because of the decision that Adam and Eve made in the Garden of Eden, he has allowed man to go his own way. And now we're seeing cities burning. And now we're seeing so much hatred and contempt and violence and division. We're right at the tail end of that 6,000 year period. It is senseless. It's purposeless. There is no plan or purpose or design behind it. There's a spirit being behind it who hates God and who hates God's purpose. And he knows that his time is about up. But here's Churchill with some bit of discernment back in 1915 and understanding and wisdom, saying the absolute planlessness here in this war, it makes one suspect a bigger plan elsewhere. Could that be true? Is God working out a bigger plan elsewhere? Is that plan and purpose about to be put in place, even here on this earth? The Apostle Paul said, if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men most miserable. If our hope is in Minneapolis, we're going to end up miserable. If our hope is in human government, we're going to end up miserable. If our hope is in the educational system of this world, we're going to end up miserable. Our hope is in God's coming kingdom. Thy kingdom come. Herbert Armstrong in Mystery of the Ages, he said, human life is at once of infinitesimally less value than they suppose, and at the same time of supremely greater potential than they know. Human life, infinitesimally less value than they suppose. Here we're doing everything that we can to just save a life, to extend a physical life for a few more days, to keep it from dying of sickness, or if you're a rioter, just to try to extend your life for a few more days. There's no hope for the future. There's no hope in God's purpose and plan. It's just all about the here and now, what's right directly in front of our face. And what Paul said in 1 Corinthians, I read it, it's just leading to a lot of misery. A lot of misery. Churchill said, he must indeed have a blind soul who cannot see that some great purpose and design is being worked out here below. He said, of which we have the honor to be the faithful servants. How much more does that apply to you and me? We have the honor of being God's faithful servants, of finishing God's work before the return of Jesus Christ, of sounding the alarm, of being a voice of reason and truth and soundness in a world full of lies and deception and darkness. What an honor it is to be the faithful servants of Jesus Christ. Mr. Armstrong said in The U.S. and Britain in Prophecy, he said this about Churchill's statement there at Congress, but he did not understand that purpose. That great purpose long ago was master planned by the mastermind of the universe. There is, in fact, a great purpose being worked out here below. And if our minds are willing, if we're submissive to God's authority, God can open our minds to that purpose and plan, and we won't be blind. We won't be a blind soul. We'll be able to see. We'll be able to see right into God's future. You're listening to Stephen Flurry, and this is the Trumpet Daily Radio Show. If you'd like to email the program, you can send comments, as always, to td@kpcg.fm. We thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us all week, and we'll see you next week.